light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. I think so often when we look at others and we look at our communities, even our national community, even our global community, there is a perception of things being very conveniently categorized. And the problem with a category is it encourages people to look at each other in a very one-dimensional fashion, or one or two-dimensional, I guess, very, very flat, as if there was only one truth to them. And my thoughts are going a couple different directions. On one hand, there were people in my hometown who saw my father only as the postman who delivered the mail. And yet I knew that he was a postman and an orderly and a father and all sorts of, and a bass singer in the church choir. Each of these was a different aspect of a person. So even just mentioning those four, you have a person who has at least four dimensions and four different ways of being. And in fact, all of us have far more than that. In looking at our communities and our, what are sometimes called public servants, though I don't know how many of them actually have a sense of being a public servant, such as a policeman, a fireman, a postman, a city council person, etc. And too often we look at them and we see only that one dimension, and we don't realize that they are whole people with multiple dimensions. And in some cases, they try to think of themselves only in one dimension within one particular context because it becomes overwhelming and impossible to do any other way. And when companies create policies and rules and regulations and procedures, in a sense, it's stripping the administrators of their humanity and asking them to be one-dimensional for the execution of that, or for the performance of that particular duty, when in fact humanity would be better served if they were allowed to be fully human within that position and bring their multidimensional reality to that moment. There was a particular episode of a television series called Babylon 5 that I absolutely loved, because there was a commander of the station, of the space station called Babylon 5, who was thrust into the unenviable middle position between workers who wanted better conditions and administrators who wanted finished projects. And the administrators were being very narcissistic, very selfish, and not paying attention to the needs or conditions of their workers. And the workers of course, responded in kind and reflected back to the administrators the same thing they were getting, to be selfish and concerned only about their own conditions and not concerned about the projects being finished or how it would negatively impact the whole world around them. There was a sense in which the workers needed to make a contribution or the world around them would collapse. And there was a sense in which the administrators needed to make a positive contribution or the workers couldn't do what they needed to do. They would not be empowered to perform their duties. And this unenviable situation of Captain Sinclair, I think his name was, being thrust in the middle between these two. And of course, they're both yelling at him, telling him to do what they want done. And he's having to figure out, how do you integrate two such completely opposite agendas when they're all part of the same whole in the first place? That the only answer that would work had to be a holistic answer that took in the needs of both, answered the needs of both, and yet in ways that didn't ask either side to be making all the sacrifices in ways that would ultimately create greater injury. And I can't remember exactly how it was phrased, but it was something to the effect that the representative of the corporations would say to him that as the commander of the station, it was his duty to, I can't remember if he said reestablish peace or reestablish functionality or exactly how it was, quote, by any means necessary. And so the commander of the station kept contemplating that phrase, by any means necessary, trying to figure out what would satisfy both sides, or what would not would satisfy both sides, what would create functionality and create a holistic solution, create everything working. And in the end, he called them all together into one room, and he looked at the corporate representative and said to him, "You are empowering me to do this by any means necessary." And he said, "Yes, we are," because he thought the commander was going to do what he wanted the commander to do. The commander, however, turned around and said, "I'm going to solve this by reassigning some phenomenal amount of money from the military budget to the working budget to create better conditions and safe working conditions and improve machinery and all sorts of stuff." And then, of course, the corporate representative was outraged because he wanted the corporate profit to happen at the expense of the workers. And the captain looked at him and simply said, "You better, before you give someone a smoking gun, make sure you know which way they're going to point it." And he did, the companies didn't go out of business. They weren't destitute. The workers got what they needed, better pay and better working conditions, and were able to improve things. And everything was back on track and functioning expertly and exactly as he was directed. But he did it by taking from the rich and giving to the poor, and accomplishing what both sides wanted without making the rich people poor. They weren't destitute. They didn't do without anything. But he was able to show the concern for the workers that the corporations were unwilling to show. And he understood the basic truism that you can't keep shoveling all the resources to the top. A pyramid will not stand if you take all the resources from the bottom of the pyramid and shovel it to the top, because the top of the pyramid is not equipped to support all that. Everything would crumble. And in the similar sort of way, the more the corporations wanted the workers to support their high position without receiving what they needed, the more the bottom of the pyramid would crumble and the whole pyramid would come crashing down. Captain Sinclair, or Commander Sinclair, knew this. And so he rectified everything, but he did it by, in a sense, even though it was never mentioned, he did it in a sense by embodying or manifesting or giving substance to the African word Ubuntu. We are because I am, and I am because we are. The corporations could exist only because of the existence of the workers, and the workers only had jobs because of the corporations. They were symbiotically intertwined. And so it became this challenge of saying, how do we create a win-win situation? How do we listen to what is really going on and why these people are concerned, and address that need and solve that problem without upending or without sabotaging the entire symbiotic relationship? If he had given everything to the working people in such a way that the administrators and the corporations were no longer able to survive, the working people would soon find themselves unemployed because there'd be no place to put them to work, nothing for them to do. They knew how to do certain things, and when they all worked together, all the different departments, all the different skills, when they acted collaboratively, they were able to get something done that none of them could do all by themselves. What the administrators failed to recognize is that they couldn't do what only the workers could do, and the only way the workers could do it is by having their needs met. There have been so many times, even in the last few weeks, where I have tried to call customer service and support lines and such, and I begin by identifying my needs, and they immediately try to tell me how my needs aren't what they are, and they're in no position to know that. And so really they need to listen to me when I tell them what my needs are. I'm not making it up. this really is my need, and for you to tell me that I'm not allowed to have that need, whether or not you allow it, I have the need. And if you don't meet it, it means there will be more problems. And if you do meet it in a way that also meets your needs, then we have a win-win situation. Any society that is narcissistically continuing to shovel all the resources to the top, saving nothing for the bottom and not listening to people on the bottom, is going to wind up being like a pyramid that crumbles, because the stones on the bottom are no longer able to support the summit of the pyramid. Applying this all to the spiritual realm, this kind of goes back to my perception of the Middle Ages. And, is God the top of the pyramid? And I would say, no, God is not. And in God's realm, there is not even a pyramid. There is simply a inclusiveness, that all things that have been created, all things that are able to love, all things that are able to create themselves, are all part of creation of all that is in a very egalitarian fashion. The word comes to mind from Native Americans. I think it's, if I remember correctly, it's Mataquiasan, all my relations. The idea that, as they said, that we don't inherit the future, we don't inherit the world from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. Everything is interconnected. They're all relations. It's all related. It's not deciding what is or is not related, or what does or doesn't matter. Within the Christian Bible, of course, you have that wonderful passage where the Apostle Paul writes, the hand can't say to the foot that because you're not like me, you're not a part of the body, and the eye can't say to the ear, because you're not like me, you're not a part of the body, you're not important. The body is so composed that all the pieces are necessary. Creation is so composed that all the races, all the languages, all the perspectives, all the animals, all the plants, even the insects, all of that has to be there, or the whole thing begins to fall flat. Advanced biologists will tell us that biodiversity is essential, that with every species that goes extinct, it becomes that much more difficult for the others to survive. Within this episode of Babylon 5, Commander Sinclair understood that it was a symbiotic relationship that needed to be created, a win-win situation that needed to be created. And if either side was asking for imbalance, that was the one thing he could not provide and still come up with an answer to the situation. He had to look at the situation and understand, even when they didn't, that a symbiotic relationship was the only win-win solution available. That even when they didn't understand how dependent they were upon the workers, and the workers understanding how dependent they are upon the administrators, and everyone being so dependent upon everyone else, that it is all an interconnected system that cannot be pulled apart. I mean, it would be like going to a computer, and opening it up, and because you don't know what they do, you begin yanking out different pieces and cards, and what's this? No, I don't see any use in that, so I'll throw it away. Well, by the time you get done, the computer won't work anymore. And the organization and communication of information will not happen anymore. It will be, in a sense, that you have literally killed the computer by taking its pieces apart. In a similar sort of way, there is a big danger of killing the human race by taking pieces out of it and throwing them aside because you don't believe they are ever needed. And then the time comes when they are needed, and lo and behold, they're not available anymore. It kind of reminds me of the movie Star Trek IV, in which a probe from deep space, so much larger and different than anything humanity has ever encountered, comes to Earth and starts vaporizing all the oceans and creating monumental disasters that will kill everything on the planet. And Commander Spock listens to the signal that the probe is sending and wisely deduces, there can be no answer. Because if the sound that the probe is sending going through the oceans sounds like this, what you essentially have is whale song. And because whales were rendered extinct before that probe ever arrived at Earth, there was no way to answer the probe and make the whole disaster stop. And so they essentially had to go back in time, find some whales, and bring them forward in time to that moment so that those whales could answer the probe and stop the disaster. There are so many situations in humanity and in human experience in which the thing we don't expect to need, if we get rid of it too soon, we won't have it later when we need it. The example that keeps coming to mind is, what was his first name? Alan? I think it's Alan Turing. He was a man who lived during World War II. And it's widely accepted that the outcome of World War II was changed at the point at which the Allied forces were suddenly able to break the code and begin interpreting what the Nazis were saying and where they were moving their troops and everything else. And because of breaking the code, the Allied troops were able to change their strategies and orchestrate their forces in a way that turned the tide of World War II and put an end to Adolf Hitler's regime. The turning of the tide, the breaking of the code, was all due to one man named Alan Turing. The thing that makes that so significant is that he was gay. And in World War II, they gave him a medal for breaking the code. 20 or 30 years later, they harassed him so much for being a gay man. During the 1960s, I believe it was that he was so harassed for being a gay man that he wound up committing suicide. If he had committed suicide prior to World War II, the code would never have been broken. And the entire world may have fallen under Adolf Hitler, and the entire world, instead of English, the dominant language may now be German, but it's kind of beside the point. The greater problem is that this system of fascism, regardless of what language it used, the system of fascism and tyranny and annihilating everyone who wasn't good enough for the Nazi Party, that would have continued. But because Alan Turing was able to break the code and turn the tide of World War II, the oppressive regime of Adolf Hitler was brought to an end. And people still speak of the Holocaust as being this horrific event in human history, that it started out being presented in a way that even the very educated people in Germany often bought into and often accepted. And it's disappointing, I guess, how many very intelligent people took this as a political philosophy and ran with it. And then they began making decisions about who were the good people and who were the bad people, who were the right sort of people. And a lot of what happened within the Holocaust was Adolf Hitler trying to make sure that only the right sort of people lived. And I mean, in a way, it's similar to that conflict on Babylon 5, that he was trying to enforce a will regardless of how it affected people under him. Regardless of how it affected the workers, he wanted to enforce this way of doing things. And what do you do with the people who aren't up to that standard? Well, his only solution was to create concentration camps where they would be exterminated by gas or crematorium or whatever. There were just a horrendous number of horrific ways that these people would be sent to death. In speaking of the Holocaust, I'm always a little, on a side note, I'm always a little disappointed that people speak of the Holocaust as 6 million Jews. And the Jews were simply the single largest group. And I don't think 15 million people should be forgotten simply because they weren't born Jewish. there were actually estimates actually placed the death toll at closer to 21 million. And of course, that's not even taking into account the siege of Stalingrad in Russia. And ultimately what defeated the Nazi forces, and I don't mean to keep slipping into Germany, because Germans and Nazis are not the same any more than white people and white supremacists are the same. Nazis is one particular perspective, and white supremacists is one particular perspective. And the problem is not white people, the problem is white supremacists. And I suppose they'll hate me now that I said that openly on the show, but I don't think anyone watching my shows would have would come to any other conclusion. It takes all of us working together. But it's also making those important distinctions, that it's the political philosophy of Nazism and fascism that goes to extremes that devalue human life, and that insists that 21 million people are not adequately perfected or not adequately the right people to deserve life, when in fact they did. I mean, I keep saying, if you're here and you're alive, it means you're supposed to be here. It means you're supposed to do whatever good you can during the time that you are here. And if the people of your own generation don't appreciate it, don't stop doing whatever creative good you can do, because the people 100 years from now may be extremely grateful that you did. It's not necessarily for your own generation that one creates or writes or paints or engineers or invents or builds. It's looking at the whole expanse of human history and the whole expanse of human evolution, that future generations, their progress may be absolutely dependent upon people in the current generation using their voice and using their hands and using their hearts and minds to do all the good that they can. Far too often, people want to slip into focusing on one thing and not paying attention to what is connected. And I can't remember which class it was in now, where the professor was referring to identifying what the professor called the stakeholders. That when you consider a solution, you have to carefully look at all the people who are affected by that solution. And if the Nazis had done that, instead of regarding the concentration camps as the final solution, they would have understood that they were killing their own future, just like the people killing whales were, such that there were no whales left when the time of Star Trek IV came around and this probe showed up from God knows where and was trying to talk to whales who had been on Earth far longer than humanity. And why was there no answer? And they were coming, but they were coming 100 years too late, or 200 or 300 years too late. And to understand that they're all interconnected, and that if the Nazis had considered that the people they were killing were the workers and the administrators and the presidents and the artists and the musicians, all the people that they needed to create a holistically good world, and that there were things that these people could create that the Nazis by themselves could never create. They didn't have the ability. They were as short-sighted as the people who killed all the whales until there were no whales left, within the world of Star Trek. It was horrendous short-sightedness. There is something in listening and learning and getting to know this person. And I've often said that we are entering a time, or that we are in a time, where it is becoming essential to rediscover each other, to find out what the other person knows, to become multilingual, to understand that when I can speak their language just as well as I speak my own, I will have twice as many ways of looking at things and evaluating things and coming to better solutions than I could otherwise invent. And in that, the other example that jumps into my mind was a movie I saw called Joyeux Noël. And within Joyeux Noël, it's a true historical incident that on Christmas Eve during the First World War, there was a moment where somebody in the German forces, according to the movie, started singing Silent Night in German, and somebody in the Allied forces on a bagpipe started playing the same tune because that was an internationally known holiday song. And as this person played it, and this German person, as the Scottish person played it on the bagpipes, and this German person sang it, and came out and they did the song collaboratively across the what was called no man's land, the battlefield, that at that point they remembered that it was Christmas Eve, and they remembered what it was to be a human being, even if they had different languages. And they all came out of the trenches and embraced and talked and became friends during that night. And the way the movie goes on is kind of amusing, because then they don't want to kill each other anymore. They don't want to fight. And of course, the commanders who were not at that event were very irate that they couldn't have their little war and have people killing each other, because they were friends now.
Thank you for joining us. And now may you be blessed with love and peace in the pursuit of your own dreams and in all your dealings with the diversity of humanity around you. Amen.